What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. We hope you like all of the work that we're doing on your behalf. You can always go to Facebook at Trends Podcast. You can find us on our blog, AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. You can go to iTunes, but the entire library is up on our AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. So if you're looking for something that you might have listened to a portion of, it may not be up on iTunes, right, John?
Well, no. I was experimenting with iTunes.
You were experimenting with it?
And I found if you click on
Do you have the right beaker
if you
for
go
that?
by date, it'll bring back the stuff by date. So it's actually all there.
Really?
You just got to click on those little things at the top, by name, by date.
You know, you're a bright guy.
So yeah, so we're
I wouldn't know that by the cap that you're wearing today, John, because that signals. What does that say? What is that?
What is that?
Niagara Falls.
Yes, that was a great
Oh,
trip.
the Maid of the Mist. Oh, yes, I did that. I felt like I was in the middle of one of those Irwin Allen. What was his name? Alan Irwin? The disaster films.
Right.
But I knew as we were screaming that it really wasn't the end of the earth for us. Did you see where a guy just went over Niagara Falls? I guess he's tried it a couple of times. And, let's put it this way.
Did he live to tell about it?
Well, let's put it this way, John. The Falls won, and this guy 0.
Yeah. I don't think too many people survive that.
No, you can't fool Mother Nature, John. But it's interesting because Niagara Falls, they adjust that water level. I mean, there's a lot of human intervention.
Yeah, it's amazing.
There.
I know. You told me that.
Yeah. I mean, so it's not as if it's just unbridled. So, we could do another show on Niagara Falls. But basically, John, you and I have been following a story. We broadcast right out of Connecticut. Look, everybody's got to be somewhere.
Right. That's
so
true.
Let's not try to fool you that we're nowhere. We just come out of the ether.
We could be virtual.
Virtual, yes. And you're my doppelganger, whatever that means, or my meme. So the point is that in Connecticut, folks, and John and I worked on a radio program on radio. The old thing, radio, remember that?
Radio, yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
The Lone Ranger.
It's kind of going south quick. But the point, ask iHeart. But the point is that we would talk about the state of Connecticut endlessly and almost pointlessly and needlessly.
If we were there, we'd still be talking about it
and
endlessly.
Connecticut is a mess fiscally.
There's just
How
no
else?
end to it.
No, really. It's madness. And I remember speaking to the Speaker of the House on a radio program that I was doing back in 2002, 2003. And even at that time, I said to him, and his name was Speaker Amon, I said, please, this isn't going to work. They were trying to restructure debt. I said, you've got to take the bull by the horns. So I have been a cynic, a skeptic, that they knew what they were giving away, what benefits they were giving to public employees. And look, I don't want to beat up on public employees. I'm really more upset with collaborators, people who pretend that they're looking out for the interest of taxpayers when they're really looking out for the interest of, certain organized interests that really don't represent a traditional management-employee relationship, John.
Well, I agree with you. I think we got a big problem with politicians wanting to stay in office and not want to rock the boat, but I mean, something's got to be done, and if it means you're a one-termer, hey, you're a one-termer, but let's get the job done.
Well, look, when your employees, organized as they are, basically are your foot soldiers during your campaign and also your exchequers where they provide a lot of the finances, is that really a relationship where you can manage them in a serious way?
No,
I mean,
I
come
don't
on.
think so, no.
Unfortunately. And look, I hate to say this, but it's very simple. And many states around us that are very liberal, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, they put all of their contracts, quote unquote, deals with labor unions into statute. They don't put it in a contract because a statute is a law, and a law can be changed. And I hate when a governor, I hate it, when a governor wraps some kind of deal up for 20 years, binding the hands of their successors. I believe that any governor who wants to put something forward locks you in for their term and maybe an additional year or two so they can look at it again and resolve the issues. But anything past that, yet. No. We're all speaking Russian these days, right?
Oh, that's dangerous.
Yeah. When did you have that meeting, John? When did you have that meeting? It reminds me of the old Soviet Union.
It was
John.
Natasha.
Do you remember Soviet Union? Because, I mean, I was in television for many years, and you were in television. Yeah. I'll never forget when they only had 2 channels in the Soviet Union. So you were watching, and there was Leonid Brezhnev, and he was going on for 2, 3, 4 hours. And you finally couldn't take it anymore, so you turned to Channel 2. And the individual on Channel 2 said, "So you don't like Channel 1, eh?" So, but John, some of these labor deals are really awful. And one of our governors, who was a Republican, so we've had handprints of a mess.
Everyone's got their
well, what happened was, it wasn't that he was ever going to get the support of the unions, but he wanted at best to get them to sit on their hands and not oppose him. And then you have the Democrats who know that they're their best friend, and then they just capitulate. And now Connecticut has, well, roughly an $80 billion problem as it relates to employee benefits. And that doesn't, and that's the pensions. That doesn't include, I don't believe, the medical benefits, which are all pay as you go. And the pension obligations are funded at about a tune of 45%.
And then I think the Speaker of the House is the head of the union.
Well, he's one of the leaders of the union. Yeah, that works well. You can tell that we have
a conflict of interest.
No, really. I mean, you can tell that our ethics laws need a little touch-up and dusting. Well, John, why don't we bring on, we try here, honest to goodness, I'm pretty discerning, as you know.
You are very discerning.
And I really know who knows their stuff and who is basically a poser. And I find these people, and look, we've had Steve Malanga from the Manhattan Institute on with us many, many times, and I've never heard him stumped about anything related to these issues, about the crisis we have in states today and in cities, embroiled in the worst budget battle since the Great Recession. And nobody knows more about this than Steve Malanga.
Well, I need some information, so let's get him on.
You do?
Yeah, I do, because how are we going to fix this?
I worked for the state of Connecticut for 2 years.
Oh, no.
Had I only held out, if I could have stood the agony of working in the state office building in Hartford. But I didn't. But if I were in for 10 years, John.
I thought you needed to be in for 20.
No, at that time, because that was back in the early 1980s, I would have had lifetime free medical benefits. I mean, it's gotten to a point in our state, honest to goodness, where those who are retired go into a pharmacy and they are embarrassed because they have no copay. I mean, some of the way back workers. Yeah. And people look at them like, well, they almost look at them like the woman did in that great movie by Woody Allen. Did you see Bananas?
Bananas years ago. Oh, my God.
And he's in line, and he wants to buy a dirty magazine. But he covers it up with Time and Newsweek and everything that was alive at that time. And so, of course, he goes up to the counter, and he puts those magazines out. And then it comes to...
Need a price check.
Yeah. So the guy goes, "Hey, Joe, this guy wants to buy Orgasm. How much is Orgasm?" And, well, that was a funny scene.
I remember that.
That was a very funny scene. Well, I don't think anything's going to be quite that funny once you hear how much red ink we're drowning in states and cities across America. And by the way, we talked about Connecticut. We're not even the worst. We'll tell you who's got that prize.
Oh, boy.
And maybe we'll show you a picture of Chris Christie on the beach. What do you think?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that was a classic. Well, let's go to Steve Malanga, a very serious guy and somebody who understands this issue better than virtually anyone else. Steve Malanga is with us, as we indicated. He is the George M. Yeager Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the City Journal's senior editor. And I recall the book Shakedown, The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. And I find it somewhat ironic, Steve, that you were cited as one of Governor Chris Christie's intellectual influences, and yet there he is in the middle of one of the hottest state government fracases in the country, though certainly not the hottest. And has he, for example, he came in as somebody who was really going to get all this debt and pension obligation issue behind him. Well, it's hard to get around him. But anyway, he was going to really try to do something about it. What has he been able to accomplish, for example, in New Jersey?
Well, first of all, he came into office with a Democratic legislature, and in the first 2 years in office, he really accomplished quite a bit, in part because he was out there lobbying at community meetings and town halls for his agenda, which is what you have to do, of course, when you have a legislature of the other party. And they accomplished quite a lot. They did pension reform. First of all, they managed to balance the budget in those first 2 years. When he came in, they had, it's hard to imagine this, but they had like a 2-year, $11 billion deficit. This is a state that only had about $30 billion in taxes. And they managed to balance the budget. They did pension reform. They did other kinds of governmental reforms, including, for instance, ending mandatory binding arbitration, which the cities and the municipalities and the school districts have been complaining about for a long time. The problem is that he essentially lost focus after 2 years. You may remember that in 2012, he was actually talked about as a replacement for Romney by people who weren't happy with Romney. So literally he wasn't even in office for 2 full years, and he's already thinking about running for for president, rather. That was a very big mistake, and people in the state of New Jersey felt almost immediately betrayed because 2 years wasn't enough to fix New Jersey. And then what happened, of course, was Bridgegate, which, although we still don't know exactly who was the author of all of this, it was a terrible betrayal of those people who had supported him. I talked to a lot of taxpayer groups in New Jersey. I've spoken a lot of different kinds of organizations in New Jersey, and Republicans and conservatives in particular felt really betrayed by either the people he selected or whoever it was who was the author of that whole mess, because essentially that destroyed the mandate that he had in the state. And again, when you have a legislature of the other party, you have to they have to believe that you have a mandate from the voters in order to go along with you, or they're just going to oppose you. And when he lost that mandate, reform was dead in New Jersey. And so really the state has just been drifting for 4 years since that. And that's so I consider New Jersey a tremendous lost opportunity, because they were, the first 2 years of his administration, they were heading in the right direction. And there's still things that they did which remain in place, which are extremely beneficial, but that's all they did. And New Jersey is a place, like Connecticut, that would need more than just 2 years of reform.
Yeah, we have major problems, and we talked about them in the introduction here in Connecticut. But, of course, the crown jewel of states in terms of being in a disastrous fiscal situation would have to be led by Illinois.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing that differentiates Illinois from the other states that have large problems, and particularly there are two problems that I would say for many states right now. One is pension problems, because even the states that don't have the kind of problems that we see, let's say, in Connecticut or in Illinois, are nonetheless, their pension systems are going in the wrong direction. It's extraordinary how many states are heading in the same direction that Connecticut is, even though they haven't gotten there yet. And this is after a 9-year bull market. Remember now, it's been 9 years that the market's been going up. And if that hasn't fixed these pension systems, the people in states have got to be asking themselves, and some of them are, what is going to fix them? So that's a problem that a lot of people have. What distinguishes Illinois, however, is that when they starting really with Quinn, the former governor, and the legislature there, they stopped paying their bills. And they did that. They did that starting in about 2014, 2013 really, and they start accumulating bills. They currently now have about $15 billion in unpaid bills, just unpaid bills. Now that's on top of one of the worst funded pension systems in America. The difference is this: those pension bills come due, 10 to 15 years from now. They really put a lot of pressure on you. So you do have to be putting money in them right now. But unpaid bills that are already due, they're due right now, and they have $15 billion of them, and they only collect about $35 billion a year in taxes. And so what's happening there, which is really a mess, is that now courts are starting to rule against them. And the courts are starting to say, you have to pay these bills. And you can't say it's a different. If one thing is if a court says, you have to pay your pension bills, when they come due, because they're going to come due over the next 15 to 20 years. But when a court says you have all these bills, like their Medicaid bills are about $3 billion of unpaid bills, and the federal court recently said you have to start paying those back. So they're facing a situation right now where if they get too many decisions like that, they simply don't have the money for that. They just don't have the money. In fact, even now, they're talking about borrowing money to be able to pay back the money they owe.
Well, Connecticut has done this to some extent. But, when you say a Medicaid bill, that says to me that there are doctors, there are hospitals, clinics. Exactly. I mean, how many of them have gone out, and what does that do to the fabric of a state?
Well, see, this is exactly the point, because they don't just owe this money to themselves or to the pension system, for instance. They owe this money to contractors. And contractors are people who work for the state. Doctors and hospitals are some of the biggest losers in all of this, but people who bill things for the state, much of road construction and road repair in states these days is done by private contractors contracting with the state. Those are the people who aren't getting paid. In addition to that, of course, you probably know the story that they also weren't able to pay out their lottery winnings.
Yes.
And so, they've been kicked out of the
mega millions
states.
Yeah.
Exactly. They've been kicked out of that. So yes, you're absolutely right. And that's why this is such a dire situation, because in my opinion, there are a lot of states, more states than you think, heading in the wrong direction. But with most states, it's kind of a slow motion process. And unfortunately, maybe because it's a slow motion process, oftentimes state legislators and governors take more time than they should to fix things. But with Illinois, it's right there in front of you right now. This impasse that they've had now, really going back to before Browner, the current governor, was elected in 2014, has just really, given them essentially something that's unprecedented. The only thing similar is the same thing happened in California when you had this transition from Gray Davis to Arnold Schwarzenegger. You remember California also wasn't paying its bills, and they were doing all kinds of things. Like they weren't sending tax refunds to people and to businesses in California. Now the difference is they had about $3 or $4 billion in unpaid bills, but their budget is like 4 times the size of Illinois, and so they did have room to fix it, and they did a lot of maneuvering. California did a lot of maneuvering too, but they also had Silicon Valley, and once Silicon Valley recovered, they were able to slowly dig their way out of this, although they haven't fixed their pension system in California.
Now, I was reading where 33 states have reported lower revenues than initially projected in the latest fiscal year. So that, suggests that your point that there are many states in trouble and going in the wrong direction. But if you were to tick off the ones that are today in imminent danger and where bankruptcy, if it were allowed, and is it, really could enter into that process, which are the worst?
Well, I think, first of all, you're absolutely right about this. This is the slowest recovery since World War II for the states. And it's so slow that even though we've had this 8 or 9 year so-called recovery, most states, if you adjust for inflation, are actually collecting less money today in tax revenues than they were in 2007. But in the meantime, their pensions have gone up. costs. Healthcare has gone up. They added Medicaid. They expanded their Medicaid. They've been really holding back education spending. Very few states are expanding their education spending. Transportation spending, infrastructure spending, all those things are suffering. We're getting crowded out. Now, you talk about the issue of insolvency. Okay, most states have a lot of financial flexibility compared to, let's say, municipalities like cities. Most cities in America, most municipalities can only raise property taxes. That's about the only power that they have. And if they want to raise any other tax, essentially they have to go to the state government and ask them to do it. States, they have income taxes, they have corporate income taxes, they have sales taxes. And so they have a lot of flexibility. States also have a lot of different funds. And one of the ways they keep themselves afloat, and this is not necessarily
robbing
a good thing.
From
exactly,
specific
they
funds.
steal from funds. So they have transportation funds, and New Jersey is a good example of this, where they put their money in the transportation funds, and it's supposed to just go for transportation. Or New York State is an example. And then when they get in a budget crisis, they swipe money from that fund. They have other kinds of funds. A perfect example is workers' compensation funds. Businesses are taxed in every state to put money in a workers' compensation fund or in an workers' unemployment fund. So when you have a recession, you have money there. A number of states, New Jersey especially, basically took money out of their unemployment compensation fund to balance their budget and grow other programs for years. And when the recession struck, these states had to borrow money from the federal government in order to, and so they spent a lot of the recovery paying back the federal government, so that money, rather than recovering and helping the state get back on its economic footing, had to go to the federal government. So they have a lot of ways that they can, avoid, if you will, insolvency, but they do it in ways that sort of make the problems deeper down the road. Illinois is obviously the most problematic state. It's the only state that I think could actually have a situation where it simply didn't have money to actually pay people at some point. But that's a pretty extreme thing to say for a state, given the economic power of states. The other states with the worst budget problems are clearly, again, we've mentioned New Jersey, we've mentioned Illinois, Connecticut. You look at some of the states in the oil belt were really facing a financial squeeze for a while, but now that the frackers are really kind of extraordinary because everybody thought that these states, like Alaska is a good example, were simply going to or even Texas, we're going to have extreme financial problems. They started having that, and but what happened is the frackers continue to innovate, and they lower their cost, and now they're pumping again, and they're actually making money again. So those states are dragging their way out of that particular problem. But the long-term issue is that what's happening is the whole landscape is changing. For years, states basically said they're going to spend money on education, and they've got budgets. Basically, a lot of your local education budgets are based significantly on state spending. They're going to pay money on Medicaid. A lot of states have expanded Medicaid over the years. Okay, and they were going to only spend 2 to 3% of the budgets on pensions. Now that entire formula is being blown up, and so what you have is a situation where all these different programs are crowding each other out, and they can't continue to spend money on all these things at the same time. So what's going to happen is the priorities have to change, and that's what the fight is over in so many states. There were 11 states this year that did not pass a state budget by the time the last fiscal year ended. So Connecticut was not alone. 11 states is a very unusual number of states. Not only that, but there were something like, I can't remember the exact numbers, maybe 15 states that in the middle of the year, like Connecticut, said, whoops, we're not going to take in as much tax revenue as we thought. So, and that's for 8 or 9 years into an expansion that's very unusual. In previous expansions, once you got past 3 or 4 years, it's very unusual to have more than 1 or 2 states saying, "Oh, this is a problem. We've got a mid-year problem." But we had double-digit numbers in some of the recent years. So the states are dealing with this crunch, and the place that it really matters, because the states have their own financial power and financial flexibility, it matters in municipalities and school districts. If you look around the country, those are the people who it's being pushed down onto them. So I'll give you an example. California, has significant budget problems, but their municipalities in California, their school districts, they're saying literally, we don't know how we're going to pay for some of these costs, and specifically pension costs, because the state essentially is basically bailing itself out, if you will. You see the same thing for municipalities around the country. Illinois has got big problems, but Chicago, its chief city, has got bigger problems.
Well, looking in Connecticut, Hartford is on the verge of bankruptcy.
Exactly.
And I want to get back to this example of Connecticut because I understand it pretty well. We haven't put away for public pensions for many years. And now we've been trying, but we can't even begin to catch up because it's been about a 30 or 40-year process where we weren't putting away. And at the same time, we've offered these incredibly generous health benefits, and they're pay-as-you-go. So literally, there's 2% put away for that. There's about 40-some-odd% put away, which is way underfunded for the pensions. My question is, because I think a lot of people listening to this around the country, they think Connecticut is, a group of very, very wealthy communities all bundled together. We have the highest per capita income and have for many years here in the state. How is it possible that so many states have gone so wrong? Are they under one form of leadership? I know the Democrats basically have controlled the action in Connecticut, though Republican governors have gone along for many years.
Yes, I think there's a couple of things. There's a big argument about whether this is a blue problem or a red problem. Although clearly some of the states with the most dysfunctional problems right now do seem to be, leaning blue, but there are definitely some red states that have done some things, some Republican-dominated states that have done some very questionable things too. I did see a recent academic paper which suggested that the states that have the largest problems are the states that have a collective bargaining for public sector employees, which is another kind of...
And what about walling off those benefits into contracts versus statute?
Okay, so this is a very, very, very big issue. Essentially, you've got several levels of guarantee for these pensions. The crucial thing, let me just say this first of all, the crucial thing is that in about half of all states, public sector employee pensions in particular are given far more protections than private sector pensions are given by federal law. Okay, and this is one of the origins of the problem because people started realizing about in 2009 and 2010 in many states that they had a problem. And many states did pension reform. Many of those pension reforms have been overturned by the courts. These are reforms that if a private sector business did them or had to do them, they would have been fined because they're completely legal from in terms of federal law. But about half of the states have given unusual protection to public sector employee pensions, and they are either because of the way their laws or in some cases their constitutions were written. New York State and Illinois have constitutional protections for public employee pensions. And in some cases, it was the way the courts in these states, the state courts, not federal courts, state courts, have interpreted the laws that were written. And the crucial difference, if you want to sum it all up very quickly, is this. In the private sector, I get to keep all the benefits I've earned for the work I've done right now. But if my employer comes in tomorrow and says, we can't afford this plan at the level that it's at right now, so starting from here on in, we're going to be contributing less, I haven't done that work, and it's perfectly fine for them to do that. In about half of the states, to one degree or another, by contrast, what courts or laws have said is that once you start working for a public pension system in America, they can never alter the rate at which you earn benefits, even for work you have not yet done. And this is Illinois' biggest problem right now. They can't change a thing for anybody who's working in that system, who's vested in the system for the next 20 or 30 years. So the people will keep earning benefits at the level that essentially has gotten the system into trouble in the first place. And that's really, it's hard to sum it all up there because they're all different wrinkles in these states because there's no federal law that governs this. Mm-hmm. But that's essentially the problem.
Well, have we gotten into a lot of these difficulties not only because of the generosity of various state governments and then locking these things into some form of law or contract that is almost unassailable in terms of trying to change it, but also just the lack of honest accounting and the trickery that goes on. You talked about one of the tricks, which is to take something that is devoted to environment and move it in to pay your salaries this week, or premium borrowing where you borrow over the amount that you need, and that papers over some of your more current problems, but also the idea of really falsifying goals in terms of return on investments or any of the money that you've put away, and just kind of in a way balancing budgets on the back of this non-existent goal because it can't be met.
Yeah, this is the singular problem, although it expresses itself in a 1,000 different ways. The biggest problem is not just related to pensions. The biggest problem is there is no standard accounting that is required of states or of municipalities, except insofar as a state says to a municipality, this is the way you have to do accounting. And unlike, again, the federal government gets to dictate how you, as a private business, how you do, if you have any kind of debt that you offer, or if you float stock or anything like that, you have to adhere to certain standards, including certain accounting standards. There are no standards for states, which are considered within our Constitution sovereign entities. They get to do what they want. And one of the biggest criticisms of the states, there's a group called the Volcker Alliance, which is being headed by Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, which has analyzed this. And their biggest criticism is that basically the states are using accounting practices from the 19th century and early 20th century, which obscure their actual financial positions. Now, this is something that once you get into the complexities of pension accounting is so easy to do. And so you have a lot of accounting now, which has essentially states have basically changed accounting in midstream. They've you've had legislatures that actually from year to year will change some of the assumptions of the plan in order to make the plan look better than it needs to look, so that they could collect fewer taxes and put fewer taxes into the pension system if they have other kinds of deficit problems. You have all this kind of stuff going on. And I wrote a piece recently in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, it got a lot of attention about creative accounting, and it leads to a fraud conviction. Will this maybe put some of these folks on alert? Tell people what it was.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Essentially, for a long time, people have said, why doesn't somebody do something about this? And they keep saying, why doesn't the federal government do something about this? And there's a big debate about whether the federal government can do something.
Yeah, well, they're
in
such great shape themselves.
Well, there you go. That's one thing. And do we really want the federal government dictating to us? But here's the thing. Every state and most municipalities in America, they issue debt. And when they issue debt and they trade debt in a public marketplace, so that in the private sector, if you have a company and you have stock or you have debt, you have to adhere to the accounting of the Securities and Exchange Commission, because forget about taxpayers. If someone's an investor in your your stock or is your debt, they have to have some assurances that what you're doing is legitimate in terms of accounting. So, but for years, the federal government and the SEC have been unable to also regulate municipalities that issue debt, because there's a part of federal law, the securities law, which says the SEC has to stay out of the business of states and cities, with one exception. And the one exception is a state or a city cannot commit fraud. They cannot lie to people about the state of their, let's say, their pension system or their budget. If they have debt, you can't lie to someone. And so, since 2009, after the meltdown of the financial markets, the SEC has gotten more aggressive about saying to states and municipalities, you're misleading investors, and in misleading investors with this accounting you're using, you're essentially committing fraud. And they began, first of all, by just citing a few places, like New Jersey with its pension system and Illinois with its pension system, and telling them, we caught you doing this, you better stop doing it. After a while, they stopped just saying, we caught you doing this. They actually started fining people and banning people from participating in the market. So there were some mayors of some cities in America, a small town in Illinois, the budget director of Miami, places like that essentially the Securities and Exchange Commission cited these people and they fined them. And then finally, in this small town it's not actually that small, it's about, I think, 50,000 people in Ramapo, New York, they actually, federal prosecutors actually indicted public officials for the first time for just simply misleading investors. Now, over the years, of course, federal officials have oftentimes put mayors and councilmen and people like that on trial for things like accepting bribes or bid rigging or stuff like that. But this is the first time that they ever said you essentially misled people about the nature of your budget. And in this case, is because the budget was in much worse shape than they were admitting to, because they were trying to spend money to essentially build a baseball stadium for a minor league team that the town didn't want, but the mayor and the town officials wanted it, the town supervisor wanted it, and so they misled people by doing a whole bunch of accounting tricks, and so they put this town supervisor on trial for this. First time this had ever been done. And the significant thing is he was convicted. But as I said in this Wall Street Journal piece that I wrote, what was really significant here is if you look at some of the things they did, shifting money between accounts, using borrowed money for things other than what they said they were going to use it for, this is stuff that
goes on all the time.
And cities have been doing, for a long time. And this should be a wake-up call.
Well, I do hope
it's a wake-up call.
If the Bob McDonnell case is any indication, I said when I was on radio that look out, the floodgates are open if this stuff is legal in Virginia. And what did we just see? Of course, Sheldon Silver in New York getting sprung from jail as a result of the Bob McDonnell case. So maybe we can go in the opposite direction here. Steve, we only have a short period of time. When we start hearing about these issues, or people take more note of the problems that states and cities are having and all the squabbles and all the things left undone, like infrastructure. I mean, look at the mess you've got in New York City right now with these terrible train situations and so forth. And we begin to see this, and people begin to wake up to these problems. What do you see as the key trends going on in state financing? I mean, are people really looking for ways out? I see one positive sign, Gina Raimondo, a Democrat in Rhode Island, and what she was able to do. Are we going to see people getting much more honest and earnest and determined as it relates to fiscal messes that they have built?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. First of all, unfortunately, Rhode Island is an exception, really. And what I would say is that the thing that struck me, particularly going back to, let's say, 2012 and 2013, is that rather than facing up to the problems, politicians have done everything they could in many places to avoid the problems. The difference is that rather than this economy taking off, and rather than tax revenues collections responding the way they have in the past, they've been incredibly mediocre. States are predicting a 1% increase in tax revenues this year. We're 9 years into a recovery, and 1%. So what's happened is they've really run out of options right now. And so at some point, it really needs to be voters who say, look, I think voters don't understand because the budgets have become so complicated and also so basically untruthful. But we need to go back to basic priorities. The infrastructure is the perfect example of all this. It's extraordinary that, we build these transportation systems and then we don't maintain them. We spend money instead. We're going to expand Medicaid and put in pre-K for school, and we're not fixing our signals in the subway system. So it's extraordinary. Or we want to build a bullet train or some super new, infrastructure when we're not fixing the infrastructure that we have. So it's people who have to say, these are the first priorities.
I know. Well, I've got to say this, and I don't know if I'm paraphrasing the right genius statesman, but I'll use Winston Churchill because that's who I was told said this. And he said, I believe, once we've run out of money, then we've really got to start thinking. And I think we're there.
Well, I guess that's the optimistic view. Yes, yeah. No, I do think we're there. The problem is with some of these, like the pension system problem. When you get to the point where there's no more money, the road back is very long, and that's the thing that people are only now starting to realize. It's not a simple fix.
Well, listen, that means that if this is going to go on and persist for a long time, and we're looking at trends in our culture, then we're going to have you back, Steve Malanga, to help us through this thicket one more time, okay?
With better news, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think I may then delay the next visit for another 5 or 10 years. But listen, thank you so much for coming by today on AmericaTrendsPodcast.com.
My pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thank you. If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way, it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share our lists.
No spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Even
Nobody's
if they
asked us. But.
Right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to check it out now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us @Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
certain- What's that?
Let
They're
us
not going to
out.
let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.